welcome to an all-new episode of WTFriday. As I mentioned on Wednesday, I feel like I've cheated or disappointed you guys this past week or so. So in an effort to make it all up to you, I present to you tonight's episode. It's pretty disturbing, but then again, this is the After Dark episode.
Welcome to What the Friday, the After Dark series presented by Mystery, Murder, and Magic. Listener discretion is advised.
In the early 1980s, a large number of bodies that had been mutilated in the same way started turning up in Russia. And because they had all been mutilated in the same way, police believed that it was the work of one person. But who? They had a particular profile for the type of person that was committing these heinous murders, but they didn't have a person of interest yet. And they felt that person committing these heinous murders was a male in his 30s and possibly someone who had previously committed petty crimes. But that profile couldn't have been more the opposite of the person committing these acts. Andrei Chikatilo was born in 1936 to a farming family who was struggling to make ends meet in the Ukraine SSR. The family lived in a one-room hut, and because of a famine, they were just barely surviving. His childhood was a very unhappy one, and he was very, very lonely. He had been told by his mom that his older brother had been kidnapped and eaten by neighbors because of that famine. So he had that weighing on his mind as a little kid. And school wasn't a refuge for him either. He was picked on because of his small size. And then when his father became a prisoner of war during World War II, he was picked on for that. And despite all the odds against him, Andrei was this exceptionally bright student, and he ended up graduating at the top of his class. Now, through his adult years, or the early adult years, Andrei wasn't very lucky in love either. He suffered from impotence, and this caused issues in all of his relationships because he couldn't perform. Well, that and the bullying that he had endured as a younger child had made him this awkward and hateful man, and he mostly hated himself. And at one point, he even attempted suicide by trying to hang himself. In the late 1950s, he was drafted into the Soviet Army, and that was probably the best thing that could have happened for him. In his life, it seemed to do a complete turnaround. He served through his assigned enlisted time with flying colors, and when that enlistment came to an end, he joined the Communist Party, and he excelled there. A few years later, he married, and miraculously, the couple had 2 children despite his impotence. Now, during that time, he completed a 5-year course in Russian literature at Rostov University. And before long, he was actually teaching Russian literature. Now, by all accounts and appearances, it seemed that Andrei had his life together. I mean, he was married and had a teaching position. He had these little kids at home. But deep down, that fragile, damaged little boy was still there. And he soon emerged, unleashing his wrath on unsuspecting, innocent people. Now, as I mentioned, Andrei was a teacher, and this was at a boarding school. And when he had issues keeping his students in line, he'd retaliate. 2 of those kids that he retaliated on from his classes, he sexually assaulted. But y'all get this. The school that he was a teacher at did absolutely nothing about the assaults. Not even a write-up. And they even let him continue doing his normal duties, which included monitoring the girls' dorms. So what the hell was that about? Well, that didn't last long because the complaints against him started surfacing to the public, so the school was forced to fire him. But other than being fired, there was really no further repercussions. Now, after losing his job as a teacher, something stirred in him. He was no longer one to just sit and take criticism. he was ready for revenge. Well, after he lost that teaching job, he was no longer able to find a job as a teacher because of his reputation as a child molester. So he had to take a job as a clerk at this raw materials factory in Rostov. So he had to travel to and from his job a lot by train. Now, it's believed that Andrei's first victim was 9-year-old Yelena Zakotnova. And it is said that Yelena was lured into an abandoned shack where Andrei tried to rape her, but he couldn't maintain an erection. In an effort to control the little girl, Andrei slashed her, and this slashing led to Andrei ejaculating. And this shows that he was psychologically turned on and sexually satisfied by violence. Now, another man was arrested, convicted, and ultimately executed for Yelena's murder. But many people believed the wrong man was charged. And this was in September of 1978. Drops of Yelena's blood had been found near Andrei's house, and her book bag was also found by a riverbank that was at the end of the street that Andrei lived on. Plus, someone had seen Andrei at a bus stop with Yelena just maybe hours, maybe even minutes before her death. And they described him, the man that they saw with Yelena, in a way that sounded a lot like Andrei. But Andrei's wife provided a rock-solid alibi for him. Well, this convinced Andrei that these murders would be easy to get away with, and soon bodies were showing up left and right. All of his victims were drifters or runaways who no one would miss. He would find them at bus stops or train stations. He would stab them to overpower them, and then put some type of gag over their mouths to keep them quiet. Sometimes he would even mutilate them with his teeth. And other times, he would attempt to rape them before covering their bodies with leaves or dirt. But the most macabre thing that he did to every single one of his victims, which became his signature move, was that he gouged out their eyes. Later, Andrei told investigators that he did this because he was afraid his image had been burned into their eyes. His next victim was 17-year-old Larissa Tikchenko. He strangled, stabbed, and stuffed her mouth with dirt and leaves to keep her quiet. And from this violent attack, he once again got sexual satisfaction. Now, it wasn't just a few victims that Andrei claimed the lives of. In all, he committed 56 murders. Nearly all of them were female. In many of the cases, he ate the sexual organs of his victims, and in others, he cut off body parts like the tips of their noses or their tongues. When the police finally caught up with Andrei, it still took a little while to get him in court. Because of loopholes, and because of those loopholes, he was arrested and released multiple times. One of the times that he was released was because the semen found at the crime scenes didn't match Andrei's blood type. Police thought they were looking for somebody with an AB blood type, and when Andrei's blood was tested, they found that his blood type was type A. Well, later they found that Andrei was in this rare group of people that are nicknamed non-secretors, and what that means is that the blood type can only be determined from the blood itself, and no other bodily fluid such as semen. And remember, this was long before DNA advances had been made. So finally in 1990, he was arrested and kept in jail. And how this came about is interesting. So on November the 6th, 1990, which was shortly after he murdered Svetka Korostik, police noticed Andrei behaving oddly, so they made a note of his details, and soon they linked him to his 1984 arrest. Well, from there, they started really watching him. On November the 20th of that same year, he was spotted again acting oddly, so this time they arrested him. He wouldn't really talk to the police after his arrest, so a psychiatrist named Buck Kanavosky asked to speak with him. The psychiatrist used the pretense that he wanted to learn how the mind of a killer works so that he could interrogate Andre. Well, this inflated Andre's ego, and he was just as proud as a peacock that someone was interested in him. So he quickly offered up a confession. 53 of the murders that he was accused of were confirmed, and the police were actually shocked that there were so many because they only knew about 36 of them. And they were shocked that Andre was much older than the person they had profiled. After the psychiatrist questioned Andre, he declared Andre competent to stand trial. When the case finally went to court on April of 1992, Andre was held in an iron cage to keep him from being able to access the jury or anyone else in the courtroom, and to keep anyone from being able to access him. Well, while he was in the iron cage, he would randomly burst out singing or mumble unintelligible words, and he even dropped his pants, mooning the court. Once when Andre was being escorted out of the courtroom during a recess, one of the victim's brothers threw a large piece of metal that he had smuggled into the courtroom at Andre and hit him square in the chest. Officers in the courtroom rushed to detain that young man, but the other spectators in the room surrounded Andre, and no further attempts were made to arrest this young man. Well, this trial went on until August the 9th, when both the prosecution and defense presented their closing arguments to the judge and the two-person jury. But during the closing arguments, Andre had another sudden outburst and had to be removed from the court, and this delayed the trial until October 14th. Now, when court reconvened on October 14th, the judge read the list of murders again, which took all of that day and into the next. On October 15th, Andre was found guilty of 52 of the 53 murders and sentenced to death on each of those charges. And with that, Andre kicked his bench across the cage and shouted. In January of 1994, then Russian President Boris Yeltsin denied a final request for clemency, and on Valentine's Day of that year, Andre was executed by a single gunshot behind his right ear. During the time that Andre was carrying out his murder spree, he was still a father and a husband. Now, whether his family knew what he was up to isn't something that I found information on, but you can imagine how they must have felt when they found out the severity of his crimes and just how many of those crimes he had committed. Can't imagine sharing a home with someone who is out raping and killing and mutilating, sometimes cannibalizing over and over again. This whole story is just so sad on so many levels, and it affected so many people. With every victim, or every murder, sorry about that, with every murder, with every crime, there are like countless victims. Well, that's all I have for tonight's episode of What the Friday. Have a good evening, and don't forget to come back in the morning for the Weekend Weird Files.